married to Diego for 50 years. I served his parents, managed the household, and raised our children. He praised me to everyone, speaking of how wonderful I was. Yet, on his deathbed, after sending our children away, his gaze toward me was no longer gentle. His eyes were full of resentment and bitterness. Bianca, the biggest mistake of my life was marrying you. I regret it. I hate it. I was shocked, unable to understand. After he drew his last breath, I found the answer in the palm of his tightly clenched hand. It turned out that Diego and his childhood sweetheart had made a 7-year vow, a promise to marry if neither of them wed another during that time. When I opened my eyes again, I had clarity. Diego, let's part ways and leave each other in peace. Chapter 1. Bianca, why are you off work so early today? I just saw Diego come back. He looked so radiant, clearly something good happened. Could it be that your marriage application was approved? Are we going to have a wedding banquet soon? Just as I was about to open the gate to the yard, Sandra, my neighbor who was sorting vegetables, spotted me, faced with her inquisitive gaze. I mentally calculated the timeline. Diego's friend just returned from overseas. Sandra looked a little disappointed at the lack of wedding news. So, are you and Diego getting married before the end of the year? We're all waiting. In my previous life, I was supposed to marry Diego in just 2 weeks. But now, I clutched the marriage application tucked in my pocket. Half an hour ago, I realized I had been reborn. The first thing I did was head to the office and retrieve the marriage application for Diego and me. After handling Sandra's questions, I pushed open the gate to the yard. Diego was standing just inside. We came face to face unexpectedly. He was dressed in his neatly pressed work uniform, which accentuated his broad shoulders, slim waist, and long legs. He looked exactly as I remembered. His deep, piercing eyes gazed at me with confidence, composure, and a hint of coldness. It had taken me a lifetime to understand that the coldness in his eyes wasn't a personality trait, it stemmed from his dislike for me. How did you know I had a friend returning from overseas? Diego asked. His brows furrowed as he studied me. It seemed he had overheard my conversation with Sandra. Meeting his gaze, I calmly replied, "Didn't you mention it?" Diego's suspicion deepened. When did I say that? In my previous life, Diego's childhood sweetheart, Rita, returned on this exact day. He had kept it a secret from me until an accident forced him to introduce her. You don't remember? I answered. If you didn't say it, how would I know? Diego stayed silent, scrutinizing me as though I were a spy. Seeing how composed and indifferent I was, he began to doubt himself. Maybe he had mentioned it without realizing. Clearing his throat, he said, "Right. I was going to tell you. A friend of mine just returned from overseas and doesn't have a place to stay. I was about to help her find somewhere, so I won't be back for dinner tonight." I hadn't planned on cooking for him anyway. "All right, go ahead," I replied with a nod. Diego was momentarily startled by my quick agreement. I knew what he was thinking. Diego was a handsome man and, after leaving the military, had become a high school math teacher, a coveted bachelor in many women's eyes. Naturally, I used to keep a tight watch on him. Whenever he went out, I'd ask where he was going, who he was meeting, and I'd dig into the person's background. Over time, it annoyed him. He started sneaking out whenever I wasn't home. Today, he had planned to do the same, but he hadn't expected me to return early. "Why are you staring at me? Hurry up and go. Don't keep your friend waiting." Now, not only was I not questioning him, but I was urging him to leave. The sooner he left, the sooner I could handle my own business. "Here, this is some chocolate." Diego hesitated before pulling a piece of chocolate out of his pocket. In my previous life, this never happened. I glanced at the chocolate in his hand. It wasn't hard to guess. He probably intended to give it to Rita. For some reason, though, he was offering it to me now. "I don't eat this kind of thing. It'll rot my teeth." I declined. I was no longer the naive girl who'd swoon at a small gesture of kindness from him. Nor would I forget the words he spoke to me on his deathbed. "Bianca, the biggest mistake of my life was marrying you. I regret it. I hate it." Seeing my rejection, Diego tried to explain. "This isn't candy. It's chocolate." I wouldn't know the difference. You should give it to someone who does. I cut him off impatiently and walked past him into the house. This time, let him and his childhood sweetheart be tied together for good. Chapter 2. That night, Diego didn't come home. I didn't waste my time guessing what he and his childhood sweetheart, Rita, might be doing. Instead, I stayed up all night writing a report to apply for employee housing. Early the next morning, I submitted the application. The result wouldn't be out for a few days. Returning to work, I immersed myself in my duties. Time passed quietly, and before I knew it, the morning was almost over. I only had 2 or 3 patients left when Diego, carrying Rita in his arms, rushed in with hurried steps and pushed to the front of the line. Bianca, please take a look at my friend. She hurt her leg. Can you stop the bleeding first? I glanced at him briefly. I hadn't expected Diego, who had always been strict about rules and putting others first, to cut in line. Diego looked anxious. Why are you looking at me? Hurry up and check her leg. Following Diego's words, I looked at Rita's exposed calf. A shallow scratch. If they'd come any later, it would have started scabbing. I said calmly, go to the back of the line. Diego was stunned. What? I raised my voice. I said, go to the back of the line. This time, Diego heard me clearly. His brows furrowed, and his tone dropped. Bianca. I ignored him and continued tending to the patient in front of me. Diego hadn't expected me to treat him so coldly. He reached out and tugged at my arm. I turned to him sharply. Diego, you're a teacher. Don't tell me you don't understand the concept of first come, first served? Or is this how you teach your students at school? Diego was completely taken aback by my words. Sensing the tension, Rita intervened. Diego, I'm fine. Let's go to the back of the line. Hearing Rita's words, Diego finally moved, helping her to the end of the queue. When it was finally Rita's turn, I took out some iodine and dabbed it on her wound to disinfect it. All right. Just make sure to keep it dry. Diego looked incredulous. That's it? What else? Doesn't it need to be bandaged? I glanced at Rita's wound again. Sure enough, it had already scabbed over. Memories from my previous life resurfaced unbidden. I was 35 years old, and after dropping my son off at school, I stopped by the market to buy groceries. A speeding motorcycle grazed my leg, leaving a 7-centimeter long gash that bled profusely. When I left the hospital, my leg was wrapped in layers of gauze, looking like a giant rice dumpling. That evening, when Diego came home from work and saw the state of my leg, he listened to what had happened and showed no concern. Instead, he scoffed at me, calling me delicate. That little scratch? You're so fragile. Back in my day, my comrades and I got shot, and no one needed bandages like this. You're just making a fuss over nothing. Going to the hospital was a waste of money. A bit of alcohol at home would have been enough. Back then, I thought he was just a typical macho man, lacking empathy. Now I see it differently. It wasn't that he didn't understand how to care. I just wasn't the person he cared for. Sure, it needs bandaging. Go ahead, Diego. You can do it yourself. I'm off duty now and heading to lunch. I placed the basket of gauze on the table, ignoring Diego's dark expression. I picked up my lunchbox and left. Bianca, is that woman Diego was carrying your cousin? Just as I finished getting my food, Lisa from my department came over to gossip. Cousin, such a familiar term. In my previous life, Diego had taken great care of Rita but feared rumors. So, he gave her an identity. He told everyone that Rita was my cousin. With that label, no one thought twice about the future brother-in-law taking care of his cousin. Back then, I had been naive enough to believe their relationship was as pure as siblings. Naturally, I accepted the cousin narrative without question. Lisa, you're so considerate. You even pay attention to your cousin's affairs. Diego's so lucky to have you. Lisa teased. She's not my cousin. She's just a friend Diego brought back from overseas. She doesn't have any family here. I corrected her with a calm smile. Chapter 3. Aw. Lisa's jaw dropped so far she could have fit an egg in her mouth. It took her a while to process the information. And then she stammered. So Diego is really kind to his friends. Although this wasn't an era of strict feudal customs anymore, there were still unwritten rules about men and women. especially for a man like Diego, who was already engaged. To carry an unrelated woman into his fiancé's workplace, even a dog would overthink it. Lisa walked away, and as I turned around, I saw Diego standing behind me, his face cold. Once we were alone, he finally spoke. Bianca, I didn't mention this before, but my family and Rita's are old family friends. We grew up together until she was 18, when her family had to move abroad due to certain circumstances. She hasn't had it easy these past few years. Her parents both passed away, and now that she's back, she has no one else. He had said the same thing in my previous life. Back then, he painted Rita as a helpless girl with no family, evoking my sympathy so I would accept her as my cousin. I looked at him. So, what does that have to do with you telling people she's my cousin? Diego froze for a moment. In his eyes, I'd never had many good qualities, but there was one thing he did value: my kindness. I was empathetic, especially toward girls like me who had no family. I've always thought of Rita as a little sister. He explained. Now that she's back, I feel responsible for looking after her in place of her parents. But as a man, I worry that people might gossip and tarnish her reputation. So, Bianca, could you? No, I cut him off. I don't have a habit of adopting sisters. If you really think of her as a sister, then hold a proper banquet. Invite everyone over and announce it openly. If everyone knows she's your sister, then surely no one would dare to gossip. It was a perfectly reasonable suggestion, but Diego fell silent. After all, to him, Rita wasn't just a sister, she was a special sister. Despite my refusal, Diego went ahead and spread the word that Rita was my cousin, just as he had in my previous life. It didn't take long before Diego brought her into the house. He said, "The guest house Rita was staying at isn't very safe lately. I'm worried something might happen, so I asked her to stay at home for a couple of days." Rita looked at me with her big, sparkling eyes. "Bianca, I'm really sorry to trouble you like this. I was in the kitchen, whisking eggs, and didn't even look up." "Oh, this is your house. You can bring whoever you want to stay here." That's right, I was living in Diego's house. The house I inherited from my parents had been destroyed in last year's floods. But I wasn't living in Diego's house for free. I paid rent every month, cleaned the entire house, and even covered the grocery bills. Back then, I thought Diego and I would eventually marry, so I never bothered calculating who gained or lost in the arrangement. Seeing me agree so easily, Diego gave me a strange look, but he was satisfied with the outcome. With a small nod, he added, "Are you cooking? Make a bit more. Rita will be eating at home from now on too." I didn't respond, thinking I had agreed. Diego took Rita to set up her room but made a point to remind me, "Oh, and Rita doesn't eat onions, so don't put any in the food." I still didn't reply. "Diego, I think Bianca seemed upset earlier. Maybe I should just go back to the guest house," Rita whispered. The house wasn't that big, and no matter how softly they spoke, I could still hear them. Diego looked at her and said, "Bianca was born with a sour face. Don't let it bother you. Just settle in comfortably. I heard you two already submitted a marriage application. I'd feel terrible if my presence caused problems between you two." At this, Diego seemed to remember the marriage application. In truth, the application hadn't been his idea. It had happened during a meal with his colleagues. When his superiors learned about us, they nudged him, saying it was time for him to settle down and get married. I guess that back then, Diego had assumed he'd never see Rita again. Feeling resigned, he filed the application, and then, just days later, Rita came back. He was probably kicking himself with regret now. "It won't," Diego finally said after a long pause. I carried my bowl of egg noodles back to my room, but as I passed by their door, I caught a glimpse through the crack. At some point, Diego had bought a jar of snowflake cream in front of Rita. He unscrewed the lid with an eager expression, with a face full of warmth and flattery. He said, "I heard women like this kind of thing, so I bought it for you. See if you like it." Chapter 4. Snowflake cream. I couldn't help but recall how it had become a nightmare in my previous life. After a few years, Diego was promoted from teacher to grade director, and his salary wasn't small, but he was always generous, often lending money to colleagues in need. Over time, the amount of money he brought home dwindled. Sometimes, he even asked me to use my savings to help others, to take care of his parents and raise our children. I had to stretch every penny as far as it could go. In the monotony of those days, I gradually lost sight of myself. One night, Diego came home drunk. After helping him wash up and dragging him to bed, he cupped my face and stared at me for a long time. I blushed, thinking he was enchanted by me, but when he spoke, his words were cold and cutting. Bianca, why does your face look older than my mom's? Dark and rough. I froze on the spot. Can't you learn from other women and use some snowflake cream or something on your face? With that, he closed his eyes and passed out. The next morning, I didn't even bother going to the market for groceries. Instead, I went looking for snowflake cream, but I couldn't afford it. A single jar cost as much as a month's worth of groceries for the entire family. Years later, when I could finally afford it, I was already old. Diego stared at me in the mirror for a long time and said, "What's the point of slathering all that stuff on your face? Do you think it'll make you younger? Looking all gaudy like that, don't corrupt the grandkids." And then he turned and walked away. Thanks, but I usually don't use this kind of thing. I prefer imported brands, Rita said, glancing at the jar with mild disdain. You should give it to Bianca. She might like it. Sitting in my room eating noodles, I heard Diego push open the door, the snowflake cream in hand. He frowned. Why are you eating by yourself? Without looking up, I replied, because I am. What's your problem? Didn't I tell you? I swallowed the last bite of noodles and looked at him. You told me, but I didn't agree. Besides, there's only enough in the kitchen for one person. If you want to eat, go buy your own groceries and cook your own meal. Bianca, what are you trying to say? Diego's brows furrowed even deeper. It's simple. I'm not your maid. I'm not responsible for your meals or anything else. Diego's expression flickered with shock. What do you mean? Your house and my house. Once the marriage application is approved, we'll be husband and wife. There's no need to draw such clear lines between us. I stood up and looked at him calmly. Diego, do you truly want to marry me? Diego rarely showed any signs of guilt in front of me, but this time, he avoided my gaze, giving a vague response. Well, I'm not going to back out. Yes, he wouldn't back out. He'd marry me, then resent me for the rest of his life. I see Rita as a little sister, and I hope you can too. This is a gift from her for you. Diego didn't dare meet my eyes. He set the jar of snowflake cream down on the table and quickly left the room. I glanced at the snowflake cream on the table and placed it in a drawer. It just so happened to rest on top of the marriage application form. In this life, neither snowflake cream nor Diego would hold me back anymore. Chapter 5. Diego left the house, and then came back. Through the door, I heard bits and pieces of his conversation. It turned out he had gone to borrow some eggs from Sandra next door. Diego had never stepped foot in the kitchen before. But for Rita, he spent half the day tinkering away in there. He even managed to fry some eggs with a bit of flair for her. I couldn't tell how they tasted, but Rita's giggles said enough. As they ate, the two reminisced about their childhood. When they reached the year they both turned 18 and faced the upheaval that forced their separation, Rita's voice choked with emotion. Diego, do you remember the promise we made back then? Diego didn't say he remembered, nor did he say he didn't. He simply hummed in response, and then, they both fell silent, lying in bed. I couldn't help but drift into memories of my past life. The promise between Diego and Rita that if neither married anyone else, they would wed each other after 7 years was something I only discovered after Diego's death. It was written on a small, yellowed piece of paper, clenched tightly in his hand. Holding that paper, my feelings couldn't be summed up as mere sorrow. Flashes of my life with Diego played in my mind like a reel. I met Diego the year he came home from the military. It was near the end of the year, and he returned carrying a simple bag over his shoulder, holding a slip of paper. He pushed open the gate to our courtyard and looked at me, asking for directions. Comrade, excuse me, would this be Angelo's house? I was drying persimmons and turned around to look at him. Thick eyebrows, sharp eyes, and a tall, sturdy build. I couldn't find the words to describe him. My mind was filled with just one thought. Handsome, So handsome. He was unbelievably handsome. Are you looking for Angelo? He lives next door. My father answered as he lifted the curtain to step outside. Diego nodded his thanks and turned to leave. My father called after him. What's your relationship to Angelo? I'm his son, Diego, he said, turning back briefly. After he left, my father noticed I was still frozen in place and called my name. Girl. Still staring? He's already gone. My face flushed with embarrassment as I ran back into the house amidst my father's laughter. That ordinary morning, when Diego pushed open the gate, he also pushed open my heart. I became Diego's fiancée the following summer. Diego's father had been bitten by a venomous snake while working in the fields. Although he was rushed to the clinic, there was no anti-venom available for immediate treatment. Diego, who was in the middle of teaching, was called back home immediately. He knelt by his father's bedside, listening as the man delivered his final wishes. The greatest regret in his father's life was that he wouldn't live to see Diego get married and have children. Dad, I already have someone in my heart, Diego said suddenly, lifting his head. In stunned silence, Diego declared, Dad, I have feelings for Bianca. I want to marry her. The next second, everyone's eyes turned toward me. When Diego said he had someone in his heart, I felt a pang of disappointment. But when he revealed that person was me, my heart soared. In the span of 3 seconds, I experienced what it meant to rise from the dust to the clouds. Uncle, I like Diego too. I'm willing to marry him, I blurted out without hesitation. At that moment, I naively believed Diego truly cared for me. Thinking back now, he simply didn't want his father to die with regrets. I was just a tool for his filial piety. Later, the anti-venom was rushed in from a higher-level hospital, and Diego's father was saved. From then on, Diego never mentioned marriage again, always using work as an excuse to avoid the topic. Eventually, after my parents died in an accident, he couldn't back out of the engagement anymore. Diego, those were just the words of a child. Don't take them seriously, and don't dwell on them, came a voice from outside the room after a long pause. Hearing Rita's words, Diego stayed silent. Rita continued, Bianca, she's a good woman. It's obvious she likes you a lot. And you two seem well suited for each other. Her voice softened at the last sentence, as though even she didn't believe her own words. I yawned, closed my eyes, and drifted off to sleep. I never found out how Diego responded to Rita. The next morning, when I opened my door, I saw the two of them standing in the courtyard. The soft morning light bathed the entire yard. Rita was standing in front of Diego, tying his tie. Diego was tall, and to make it easier for Rita, he obediently lowered his head. The scene was both warm and picturesque. You look so handsome, Rita said with a satisfied smile after finishing the tie. Diego stretched his neck awkwardly. Do I? Of course. That's how people abroad wear it to work, Rita said with a raised brow. Wait, don't move. It looks a bit crooked. Diego froze, not daring to move a muscle. Rita adjusted the tie slightly. Then, without warning, she leaned forward and kissed him on the lips. Chapter 6. Rita's kiss caught Diego completely off guard. He instinctively took a step back, accidentally knocking over a flower pot that had been resting nearby. The clatter echoed loudly in the otherwise quiet courtyard. Bianca, Bianca, Rita quickly followed. Both of them turned toward the door in unison. When they saw me, Diego's expression cycled through a rainbow of emotions. He tried to compose himself, but it was clear he couldn't. Rita was the first to speak. Bianca, don't misunderstand. Just now, it's actually a kind of greeting custom from abroad. A kiss. And she still asked me not to misunderstand. Of course, she had just returned from abroad, and her psychological resilience was clearly stronger than most. I pressed my lips together and walked toward them. Maybe I was just born with a naturally stern face. My unsmiling demeanor made Rita's face pale. She bit her lip nervously. I pulled my hand out of my pocket. Seeing my movement, Diego instinctively yanked Rita behind him and looked at me. Bianca, if you have something to say it to me. Don't. He thought I was going to hit her. In truth, I was just pulling out a dead leaf that had gotten stuck in my pocket. I crumbled it between my fingers, letting the fragments scatter in the wind until they disappeared. Much like my feelings for Diego, I ignored Diego and glanced at Rita. Miss Rita. That's quite an interesting foreign custom. But Diego had a cold sore on his lip a couple of days ago. Medically speaking, it's a virus, be careful not to catch it. Rita's pupils widened in shock. Without looking back, I walked away. Bianca, you're just in time. Your application for staff housing has been rejected, said the department head as soon as I arrived at the office. Why? I asked, puzzled. It's because you don't meet the requirements. That's how things were in this era. If you didn't meet the criteria, nothing could get done. Director, I was about to plead with him when someone barged in loudly, interrupting me. These young people today are so unwilling to endure hardship. No one wants to go. The director turned to the newcomer and asked, still no one willing to volunteer? That's right. On the surface, it looks like a tough assignment. But once you've been there and come back, things could change significantly. From the fragments of their conversation, combined with memories from my previous life, something clicked in my mind. I suddenly remembered that the clinic had been ordered by the higher-ups to assign a medical worker to the Northwest front lines. When people heard Northwest, especially during the winter, they knew it would be a grueling assignment. Everyone avoided it. And because I was preparing to marry Diego, I hadn't volunteered either. In the end, the task fell to a newcomer at the neighboring clinic. She went, stayed for 5 years, and returned with multiple promotions. By the time she retired, she was receiving the same benefits as the director, with several talented students under her mentorship. Later, my old colleagues deeply regretted not volunteering. If I had known, I would have gone no matter what, even if it killed me. Director, I'll go. I volunteer. I raised my hand excitedly. The director turned to me, astonished. The assignment was urgent and the workload heavy. After confirming my decision several times, the director granted me a half-day leave to pack my things and say goodbye to my family. I didn't have any relatives in town, but my neighbors were kind to me. So, I went out immediately, bought groceries and meat, and invited Sandra and the others over for a meal. When Diego and Rita returned, I had just finished preparing the dishes. Why did you make so much food today? Diego asked, eyeing the table full of dishes with curiosity. Before I could answer, Sandra and the others pushed open the door, carrying festive-looking gifts in their hands. Bianca, look at what we've brought for you. I brushed past Diego to greet them. Sandra, sister-in-law, just having you here is enough. You didn't need to bring anything. How could we come empty-handed when you're hosting us for a meal? Girl, you seem so happy, treating us to a feast. Did your marriage application with Diego get approved? Hearing this, Diego's expression froze instantly. Bianca, the marriage application has been approved? Chapter 7. I glanced at Diego, then took a moment to glance at Rita beside him. Her once bright and lively face had gone pale. Sensing my gaze, Rita clutched her head and said, Diego, I have a headache. I think I'll go back to my room to rest. Diego looked at her, unsure how to comfort her. He could only nod. Okay. The people around us noticed their interaction, and the atmosphere cooled briefly. I said nothing and simply invited everyone to sit down. Soon, the lively chatter of eating and drinking filled the air again. Everyone assumed that Diego and I were about to get married, showering us with blessings. May you have many children, grow old together. All the things Diego didn't want to hear. Eventually, he found an excuse to call me outside, standing in the faint interplay of light and shadow. His features were partially obscured. Bianca, I need to know, has the marriage application really been approved? I stared at him and lied. It has, even though he should have expected this. Diego's eyes widened in disbelief. Maybe it had come sooner than he anticipated. I watched the discomfort spread across his face and pretended not to notice. The application has been approved, aren't you happy? Happy. Diego forced the word out through gritted teeth. Of course you're happy. After all, you were the one who told your father you wanted to marry me because you had feelings for me. I continued. Diego stiffened at the reminder of that moment. But, Diego, I'm not happy. Looking back at my life, the biggest mistake I ever made was marrying you. I returned his words from my previous life to him, word for word. Diego looked at me in shock, unable to understand. Bianca, what are you saying? I said it very clearly, and you heard it just as clearly. No, this can't be. Diego shook his head repeatedly. A flicker of doubt crossed his eyes, but then his expression cleared as if he'd figured it out. Looking at me, he said, I see now. You said that on purpose, didn't you? I didn't understand what he meant, taking my silence as agreement. Diego grew confident. I knew it. There's no way you'd regret marrying me. You're just jealous because Rita kissed me earlier, right? Enough. Bianca, Rita already explained, it was just a Western greeting custom. Don't hold on to it. I smiled silently. Diego seemed uneasy. I really do see Rita as a sister. You, Diego. His good sister appeared right on cue. Diego turned to see Rita standing there with a suitcase in her hand. He immediately walked over. Rita, what are you doing? Rita's eyes were red, as if she'd been crying. Seeing Diego, she forced a small smile. Diego, you and Bianca are getting married. It's not appropriate for me to stay here anymore. I should leave. It's so late. Where would you even go? Diego asked. Rita avoided his eyes. I have a friend. Diego didn't hesitate to expose her. Other than me. Who do you even know here? Rita pressed her lips together. Silent for a moment, she quickly glanced at me, then said, Diego, I wish you and Bianca a long and happy marriage, with many children. Resolutely, she shoved past Diego, grabbed her suitcase, and left without looking back. Rita! Diego called after her and ran out. As he passed me, a gust of wind followed in his wake. It felt just like my past life. On the day Diego and I were actually married, Rita had made a scene about moving out. Diego had left me, left all the guests at the banquet, and chased after her. But unlike last time, when he didn't even glance back, this time, he paused in front of me. Bianca, wait for me to come back, he said. Diego's figure disappeared into the twilight. I turned and went back inside. Sandra and the others had overheard most of what happened outside. Seeing me, they couldn't help but comment. Bianca, that cousin of yours doesn't seem easy to deal with. You should be careful. I took a bite of food and replied, she's not my cousin. She's Diego's childhood sweetheart. His little sister by affection, not by blood. What? They exchanged puzzled looks. After everyone had left, I took out the bag I had already packed and walked out of the house without looking back. Everything of mine was gone from the house. The only things left behind were the annulled marriage application and the jar of snowflake cream. Chapter 8. Diego caught up with Rita in the depths of the alley. Without saying a word, Rita threw herself into his arms and cried bitterly. When she had cried enough, Diego finally tried to persuade her. It's so late. You won't find a place to stay. Why don't you come back with me? No. I don't want to go back. Rita refused adamantly. Left with no choice, Diego took Rita to a guest house. Diego, I'm scared. Rita clung to him as he was about to leave. Can you stay with me? Diego turned around and met her tear-filled eyes. For some reason, Bianca's gaze from earlier that evening flashed through his mind. Cold, distant, and almost unfamiliar. He distinctly remembered that Bianca used to look at him differently. A wave of confusion washed over him, and he found himself blurting out, No, I need to go back. Rita froze, surprised by his swift refusal. Biting her lip, she played coy. Is it because you want to go back to Bianca? Well, of course. She's your wife now. You should be with her. After all, I'm just your sister by affection, not blood. Hearing this, Diego hesitated. Rita gave him a gentle push. Diego, don't worry about me. Go back quickly. Don't keep Bianca waiting too long. That little push helped Diego make up his mind. You're right. It's not safe for you to stay here alone. Diego picked up an extra blanket from the room and placed it at the door. I'll sleep on the floor tonight. Rita had achieved her goal, but when she tried to take things further, she hit a wall. Diego held firm and refused to cross the line. He didn't touch her. The next morning, Diego took Rita out to find and rent a place. By the time everything was settled, it was already evening. Thinking of Bianca, he felt a pang of guilt. On the way home, he stopped at a convenience store to buy her favorite snacks. He figured Bianca must be at home cooking dinner by now. Pushing open the door, he began reciting the excuse he had prepared last night. I arranged for Rita to stay at the guest house, and I was about to come back. But then, halfway through his sentence, Diego stopped cold. The kitchen was empty, Bianca wasn't there. Frowning, he went to push open the door to her room. The room was spotless and devoid of anyone. His brow twitched uncontrollably. A bad feeling began to spread through Diego's chest. Diego stepped out of the house and searched every corner of the small, cramped space again. He went in and out of the courtyard twice. When he spotted Sandra next door, he couldn't help but ask, "Sandra, have you seen Bianca?" Normally, Sandra would greet Diego with a warm smile and enthusiasm. But today, it was as if she had seen something unpleasant. She replied curtly, "Haven't seen her," and quickly went back inside. Diego felt that something was off, but he didn't think too much about it. Finding Bianca was his priority. He went back into the house. This time, he finally noticed something on the table that had been there all along. He walked closer and froze in place. On the table were the annulled marriage application and the unopened jar of snowflake cream. Diego's mind involuntarily replayed Bianca's words from the previous night. She had said, "Diego, I'm not happy. Looking back at my life, the biggest mistake I ever made was marrying you." It felt like a bolt of lightning struck him. His head buzzed, and he kept muttering to himself, This can't be. It can't be." It was hard to believe. After all, he vividly remembered the way Bianca had looked at him the first time they met. Her eyes sparkling with light. She had looked at him like he was a treasure, full of adoration. How could someone like that suddenly decide she wouldn't marry him anymore? Diego jumped on his bike and rushed to the administrative office. The result of his inquiry hit him like a ton of bricks. Bianca had taken back the marriage application over 10 days ago. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. Diego panicked. He pedaled as fast as he could to the clinic. He needed to ask Bianca why she had done this. The head nurse, seeing Diego drenched in sweat, said, "Bianca's already gone to the Northwest front lines. Didn't you know that?" Diego shook his head. He looked as though he'd just been pulled out of a lake. Utterly drained, he pushed his bicycle, soaking wet, as he trudged back home. Chapter 9. Have you found Bianca? One by one, familiar faces passed by, all aware that Diego was looking for Bianca. Diego, pale and worn, shook his head. Seeing his state, no one seemed surprised. As Diego walked a little farther away, the bystanders started whispering, "TSK, TSK. Bianca is such a good woman, and he ruined it. Serves him right." "What do you mean by that? You don't know? That Rita woman Diego keeps introducing as Bianca's cousin isn't her cousin at all. She's his mistress." "What? A mistress? And he had the audacity to bring her home? That's outright bullying Bianca." "Exactly." Diego, returning from his search, overheard and immediately scolded. "What nonsense are you spouting?" The group hesitated briefly but quickly regained their confidence. "Diego, you know perfectly well if it's nonsense or not. You're engaged, but you're fooling around with another woman. Don't think we didn't see you and that Rita woman entering the guest house together and not coming out all night." Diego faltered. We're innocent." "Innocent? Spending the night at a guest house together? Who do you think you're fooling?" "Pa, you don't deserve someone like Bianca." The group spat on the ground near Diego before walking away. Diego stood frozen in place for a long time. It wasn't until days later that Diego began to realize Bianca was truly gone. He had never thought Bianca was particularly important to him. But now, every little thing seemed to remind him of her. When he saw someone harvesting persimmons, he would remember Bianca rolling up her sleeves and climbing trees. Sitting high on a branch, she would pick a ripe persimmon and shout down, "Diego, look! Isn't this one perfectly red?" Diego would step closer and reply, "It's red." "Diego, what's red?" Rita's voice snapped him back to reality. Diego turned to see Rita standing beside him, looking puzzled. "Why are you here?" he asked. Rita smiled and held up a lunchbox. "I brought you lunch." Diego glanced at the box, frowning slightly. Rita, having spent years abroad, only knew how to prepare Western-style meals: cold bread, cold eggs, and a few pieces of lettuce. They were nothing like Bianca's steaming hot pork dumplings. "I've already eaten," Diego said hesitantly. "But..." Rita's voice wavered, feeling a bit hurt. At that moment, the school principal arrived, calling out, "Diego, come with me for a moment." About 10 minutes later, Diego emerged from the office, his expression grim. Rita, still waiting, immediately approached him. "Diego, what's wrong?" Diego shook his head without saying a word. Rita reached out to hold his arm, but Diego brushed her off. News of the meeting soon spread around the school. It turned out that a parent had reported Diego for inappropriate relationships with women, fearing he would be a bad influence on students. As a result, Diego was disqualified from being considered for the Outstanding Teacher Award he had been in line for. When Rita found out, she stormed into the principal's office to argue on Diego's behalf. By the time Diego arrived, the office was in chaos. "Diego, I only wanted to help you," Rita said, her voice trembling. "Brother." Rita thought Diego would comfort her, but instead, he scolded her harshly. "Ridiculous. Who told you to meddle in my affairs?" Rita was deeply aggrieved. "Brother, I was just trying to fight for your justice." "I don't need it." The next moment, Rita burst into tears. Outside, a crowd of teachers had gathered. Many of them had met Bianca before, and now, comparing her to Rita, they couldn't help but sigh. "So, this is the sister Diego brought back from abroad? She's nothing like Bianca. Poor Diego, his life's going to be tough from now on." Their murmurs didn't escape Diego's ears. He hadn't realized that the Bianca he once thought was plain and unremarkable was so highly regarded in everyone else's eyes. After Rita's outburst, Diego was reassigned from teaching math to becoming a PE teacher. With much more free time on his hands, Diego started reflecting. The more he thought, the more he realized how often Bianca filled his thoughts. He recalled their first meeting, Bianca, with her hair in 2 braids, wearing a red floral jacket, drying persimmons in the courtyard. When he opened the gate, it startled her. She turned to look at him, her deer-like eyes especially striking. As thoughts of Bianca consumed him, his feelings for Rita began to wane. Diego convinced himself that if he waited long enough, Bianca would return, and everything could be salvaged. But Rita sensed Diego's growing distance and didn't want to wait anymore. One evening, when Diego was drinking to drown his sorrows again, Rita climbed into his bed. The next morning, just as the neighbors were waking up but hadn't yet gone out, Rita staged a dramatic scene. She ran out of Diego's house in disheveled clothes, screaming about wanting to jump into the river. With this act, Diego's reputation was completely ruined. Left with no choice, Diego married Rita. Chapter 10. Far away on the northwest front lines. I was completely unaware of all this, nor did I have the time to speculate about Diego and Rita's ultimate fate. As the new year approached, I performed a cesarean section on a mare struggling with a difficult birth. Among the group that came to express their appreciation afterward was a doctor. Hearing about the procedure, he offered me career-changing advice. "Young lady, your hands are remarkably steady. You're wasted as just a nurse, consider specializing in surgery," he said. "If the opportunity arises, I hope to see you at the Kyoto hospital someday." Before leaving, he handed me a few books. It felt like I had found my direction in life. I pored over those books, reading them repeatedly until I had memorized every word. In the days that followed, I became the go-to person for performing surgeries on cows, sheep, or any other livestock struggling with birth among the herders. Time passed day by day. I lived a life completely different from my previous one, understanding for the first time what it meant to live freely and for myself. I never thought about Diego again. 5 years went by in a flash. My mission there came to an end, and I returned to the long-awaited health clinic. The same director who had sent me off personally came to greet me. "Bianca, welcome back." He handed me a transfer letter. "This is from Kyoto Hospital. They specifically requested you." I opened the letter and immediately recognized the handwriting. There was no doubt about it. It was from Dr. Duncan, the mentor who had set me on this path 5 years ago. Over the years, I had kept in touch with him, writing letters whenever I encountered something I didn't understand. He always replied thoughtfully. Despite his busy schedule, That evening, my colleagues held a welcome back and farewell party for me at the state-run restaurant. We ate and drank to our fill, chatting about all sorts of amusing things that had happened while I was away. Naturally, the topic of Diego and Rita came up. Ever since Diego married Rita, it was as if he had been cursed. He lost his secure teaching job and, after much effort, managed to land a position as a librarian. But even that didn't last. One day, Rita caught him chatting with a female coworker. Without a word, she grabbed the woman by her hair and attacked her. The incident not only humiliated Diego but also cost him the job. Rita, taking advantage of her pregnancy, escaped any consequences. This emboldened her further, and soon, no one in the neighborhood wanted anything to do with their family. There were plenty more stories like that. Diego must be regretting it so much now. Yes, especially when he let someone like Bianca go. Everyone instinctively glanced at me. I smiled nonchalantly, completely unbothered. After the meal, everyone gradually dispersed. Bianca! A voice suddenly called my name. I looked up. Diego was standing on the other side of the road, looking at me. In the 5 years since I last saw him, he had aged considerably. His hair had turned gray at the temples, and his one straight posture had a slight hunch. The look in his eyes shimmered with a complex mix of emotions. Bianca. I was wrong. I shouldn't have said those words. I realized he might have been reborn as well. As for his apology, I didn't think it was truly meant for me. It seemed more like a confession to himself, his regret over how this life had defied the expectations and fantasies he had in his previous one. The price he paid was too great, and the result was too bitter. So, he regretted it. Diego! Diego! Rita's sharp voice echoed from the alley behind him. Hearing it, Diego's eyes flashed with frustration and impatience. It was as though her voice carried a curse. I never thought I would see the day when Diego, who once cherished Rita above all else, would show such an expression toward her. The moment Rita appeared, chasing after him, I turned and walked away. Behind me, her shrill voice rang out, Diego, are you here to see that slut Bianca? I'm telling you, as long as I'm alive, you'll never be with that slut. Diego, don't even think about getting rid of me in this lifetime. If I have to die, I'll make sure you die with me. Diego, say you love me. If you don't, I'll jump right here and now. The sounds of her screaming, crying, and fighting gradually faded into the distance. Suddenly, a memory surfaced in my mind. In our previous life, Diego had left too hastily, and I never had the chance to tell him. Rita had a severe hereditary mental illness. Why it didn't manifest in our previous life was probably because she had been alone and basking in the glow of love. I reached the end of the street and looked up at the sky filled with stars. In the vast sea of stars, there would always be one shining just for me, and my future was bright with promise.